Hey guys, happy Friday and welcome to an entirely new segment on Young Heretics. And now for something completely different. Fridays, as most of you guys know, are when I usually stray a little bit from the typical format of the show. On Tuesdays, I will always be delivering the usual hour-long episode that will be about some topic or work from the Western canon. In particular, all this year, we're talking about the relationship between morality and art and the relationship between science and faith. And I think that's been really fun and fascinating so far. I hope you think so too. But on Fridays, I like to do something a little different. Often we'll have an interview, and I'm going to keep doing interviews as well with people out there in the world. I recently dropped a short excerpt from Paradise Lost in the audiobook that I'm building over at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. But I wanted to introduce something now that I hope we'll be able to come back to and do throughout the year, just whenever we have an extra moment together on Fridays. And I'm going to call this segment Words, 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 which is a reference to Shakespeare's Hamlet, because this is going to be about translation and specifically the act of translation, the art of translation from a literary text that's in some other language than English, and how it is that you take, let's say, a Greek text or a book in French or a poem in Italian or whatever and deliver it to an English-speaking audience. And the reason that I wanted to do this is because it's one of the questions that I get most frequently, and it's also one of the most rich and complicated topics that we deal with on the show, but we usually, in the regular course of a normal episode, we don't have that much time to really dig into the issue of translation. And still, nevertheless, I get a lot of people all the time asking me, okay, so you're reading this book, let's say it's the Iliad by Homer, and what's your recommended translation? Which one should I use if I don't read Greek? And then second, after that, how can I tell if I don't read Greek? How can I compare different translations, and what sorts of things should I be looking out for? These are terrific questions. Another one that people often ask is, can you even do translation correctly? People worry about, if the Bible was written in Hebrew and in Koine Greek, how can we be sure that we're getting the real truth of the real word of God when we're getting it translated into English? And that too is, these are profound questions. These are the sorts of things that you could spend your whole life thinking about. It's one of my most beloved areas of scholarship. It's just where I am at my most joyous when I'm thinking about the differences between languages and the nature of language and how to convey the same thought in multiple different languages. And so I thought it would be cool to just talk with you guys, and each time we do one of these words segments, I'll take a text or some short, small piece of language from some great book, and I'll mention just a few of the issues that a translator might be thinking about and how you might deal with those issues in the act of translation. And so that way, we'll never exhaust this subject. It's one of the most profound and fascinating subjects that you can think about in the literary world. But you might get from this a few kind of ideas and ways of thinking about translation, because it's one of those things that if you've never done it or thought that much about it, you wouldn't really necessarily know where to start. And I just thought it would be cool if I could equip you with a few of the tools for thinking about translations, so that when you go away, and let's say you don't read Russian, I don't read Russian, and so I often have to pick a translation of, say, Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, and obviously I'll consult with people that do read Russian, but also I feel like because I do read various other languages, because I can translate from Greek and Latin and Hebrew and, some modern languages, I'm therefore kind of better equipped to think about the sorts of issues that might be coming up, and that helps me to pick a translation. I thought I would try to offer you guys some of that in these series. Plus, this subject is so cool and so fun to nerd out about. So that's what we're going to do. Let me know, you guys, if you like this, and also if there are particular verses or texts or ideas that you would like me to deal with in this segment. Let me know that as well. If you really want if you have a big burning question about various translations of a certain line in a certain psalm, shoot me an email. You go to rejoiceevermore.substack.com to be in touch with me that way, and shoot me an email to let me know, yeah, please can you do a words segment on this or that passage or this or that text, because that would be really fun to take requests. This time, for this first one out of the gate, I'm going to talk about the first line of Homer's Iliad, because it's one of the most famous lines of poetry ever written. It's one of the ones that's been translated in innumerable different ways, and it has some interesting issues at stake that will get us thinking about some of the basic things that translators have to think about. But before I dive in to that and to the line itself, I wanted to start out by just giving a little outline of my personal theory of translation, which is also a kind of a theory of language. Now, this is not how every translator is going to deal with it. Other people might have differing opinions, and you can go to them and read them and find out. Often, if you are reading an edition that is a new translation of something, you will get an essay in the beginning where the person who's translated the text will say what they think about translation. So that's readily available for you. But when I'm doing this, here's the way I'm thinking about this stuff. In one of the minor works of Aristotle, De Interpretatione, on interpretation or on the signification of language, Aristotle talks about his idea of what words do. And this was a major innovation that he made with respect to Plato, because Plato in the Cratylus and a few other dialogues has Socrates and some others sort of lay out this idea about language, that language is a bunch of basically tokens, symbols. These words or names are signs that we use to represent things. So there's a cat. Now I have this sound cat, and that sound can be spoken, but also it can be represented in written words, which represent the spoken symbol. And the thing that symbol stands in for is the cat. Okay, so that seems actually pretty intuitive and straightforward. You've got this thing in the world, you've got this sensory experience, be it a sound or a set of scratches on paper, and there you have it. That's what words are. That's what language does. I'm vastly oversimplifying, obviously, but there's your basic ideas. You've got kind of a two-pronged theory of language. Aristotle has a third layer that he adds in, because he doesn't actually think that when we use a word like cat, we're only conveying the thing itself, and you can only have one word for that, and whatever it is in your language, that's the word for the thing. Because he's noticed that actually for a lot of things, there's a range of words even within one particular language. So if I'm thinking, for example, about the word excitement, there's a bunch of other words too, like eagerness, anxiety, thrill, right, in English, and this is true in Greek as well, and really in any language. There's a range of different words that you can use for the same vague things and concepts and ideas, and even for something like a shrub or a bush, right? What's a shrub and what's a bush? And these, for physical objects too, we can have multiple different words. And so Aristotle says, actually, words are not just tokens. They're not just little stamps or symbols of things. They're stamps or symbols of the experience that we have of things. So now there's not just the cat, and there's not just the word cat. There's also the impression that the cat makes on me. So I look at the cat and I have a bunch of experiences, sensory experiences, but also cognitive experiences, where I see the cat and the cat kind of makes an impression on me. I can internalize the existence of the cat in some way. And now I'm thinking about the cat, right? I have this inner thought about the cat. I told you this was going to get nerdy, you guys, but it's so much fun. Okay, so now I'm thinking about the cat. And what Aristotle thinks happens when that occurs, when I have that sensory impression, is that the form of the cat, that is the structure that its matter takes, has been basically reproduced in some way within my soul. So I don't have a real cat that is being formed inside my guts, because that would suck and be really painful, right? It's not like my cat then appears inside me in some way. But my soul, which includes my perceptive faculties, is shaping some part of itself in the way that the cat is shaped. And so the abstract idea of the cat can kind of take hold or root within me. And it's not an abstract idea in the sense of like the pure essence of catness, but it is an abstract idea of this particular cat that I can associate with a bunch of other abstract ideas about this particular cat. And that experience, that set of experiences that you and I and everybody has when they look at the cat, is what we are symbolizing when we say the word cat or we write the word cat. And we know that we all have some sort of analogous experience because we can use words like cat, and I can offer you this token, I can give you this symbol or sign that is the sound of the word cat, and it can call up for you a set of associations that you have. And I can't directly commune mind to mind with you. That's the whole nature of being human in some sense. We aren't able to just download our conscious experiences into other people's minds. But using language, which is this really miraculous tool, we are able to communicate in a sensory way with our senses, with our hearing, with our touch even, or with our eyes. And that sensory experience can stand in for an internal experience that you are having of the world. I'm having an experience of the world, you're having an experience of the world, and then in between, there's language, there's words. And this is a set of ideas that Thomas Aquinas, perhaps predictably, picks up in one of his works on language. It's called De Natura Verbi Intellectus, on the nature of cognitive words or intellectual language. And he too says, yeah, there's not just the words and the things. There's the thing, there's your experience of the thing, which is sort of the intellectual word or the pre-language experience that you're having, and then there's the symbol that we all agree to use to stand in for that thing or that set of experiences that we have. So now we have a tool, a way of asking what the difference is between a shrub and a bush. Because even if those words mean something like the same thing, they might convey different experiences or aspects or ways that the bush makes an impression upon us. If I say bush, that's sort of different from shrub, and there are all sorts of different associations that calls up. So that's the idea of language that I'm working with here, that it's a sensory way of sharing experiences that are not ultimately sensory, that are formal, that are about our inner spiritual life that we can only express in language. And any text, be it prose or poetry or whatever, is like a kind of monument or a painting or a sculpture that stands in for this enormous array of inward thoughts and experiences that the author was having. And so the job of the translator is to know the original language so well. Let's say the original text is in Greek. You have to know Greek so well and get to know the Greek of this author so well that all of those associations and those subtleties and those nuances can convey to you that inward, non-sensory experience, that spiritual experience that the text itself delivers. And then you have to basically strip it naked of its linguistic clothing, because the words are there to basically cover over the outline so that you can see the outlines of the author's thoughts. And then you have to strip all that clothing off and get at that sort of spiritual core of the meaning of each word and sentence and clause and so forth. And then you have to reclothe it, put it in new clothing in the language that you're translating into. And this, just as a matter of terminology, this is called the target language. So the language that you're aiming at when you translate is the language that you're going to use to reclothe this idea or this sentence or this poem. And you have to do that at the level of the whole work, but also at the level of the comma, right? Down to the very minute parts of each sentence and word that you're getting across. So that's the task of the translator. And you can see why, on the one hand, it can never be done perfectly, because there's always going to be some distance between perfect understanding and what you're actually able to get. But on the other hand, it's not impossible, because one of the things that Aristotle observes is that even though words can differ, even though we have all sorts of different words for describing things and different languages for describing things, the inner experience, the form that impresses itself upon our heart when we encounter the world, that's universal. We all have these impressions, and we tend to choose words from the language that we have to kind of shape or guide the way that we express it. It's like the words can be kind of like buckets that we use to carry the water of our inner experience. And so we all use different words in slightly different ways, and different nationalities use different languages, obviously. But the inner experience that we're having on some level is shared. And if we believe that, then we believe that translation is possible in some qualified or moderate sense. It's never going to be perfect, but it is going to be possible. If you don't believe that, if you don't believe that there is something called shared human experience across time, across place, then actually translation doesn't make any sense and is ultimately going to be impossible. I think this would be basically a postmodernist argument, and one reason why you might say as a postmodernist that there is no translation, or you can translate however you want, is because that idea of the eternal and the universal human inward experience is lacking from a lot of our kind of most trendy and erudite theories. But I don't care about those theories. That's the whole point of this show. And I do believe in a universal human nature, a universal human experience of the world, even though those experiences are varied and will change over time. It's also possible to recover the meaning of language and to get at the heart of the experience that's being conveyed to you. So there's my theory of language, and you can see why a theory of language has to also be a theory of translation and vice versa. You can also see one other important principle that you have to bear in mind, which is that inescapably, all translation involves interpretation, because interpretation just is that first step of looking at a sentence or a word or a paragraph, and through all the ambiguities and all of the different possible meanings of each word, trying to interpret to get at the heart of the inward thought or experience that was being conveyed. And then once you have that, once you have an idea or a theory of the case of what's being said, then you can find analogous words or language in the target language that will clothe that idea again in a way that sounds and feels the same to a speaker, a native speaker of the target language. If you think about an example, or let's say an analogy, think about Renaissance paintings of Jesus and those, classical, like Michelangelo or whatever, these sort of, think of the most iconic picture of Jesus or the Greek philosophers or the disciples or Mary or whatever. Just picture in your head, like, I don't know, the Madonna and Child that, or the Ognissanti Madonna or the Raphael's School of Athens, right? And if you picture in your head any Renaissance painting of antiquity, of the ancient world, there's a good chance that the people in it are going to be wearing Renaissance clothes. They're going to be dressed like dukes and peasants and kings and lowly subjects from the world of the painter. And we could just say, well, that's because they were sort of dumb and careless and unscholarly in the Renaissance. But of course, that's not the case. What actually is happening there is the painter knows that Jesus didn't wear whatever garb he's putting on to him, but he knows that garb, that shawl or that covering or that blue cloak or whatever that he's wearing has certain meaning for his audience, that in the world of his audience, these clothes convey certain spiritual internal things like royalty or power or submission or anything that you like, that all the things that the language of clothing can convey. And so he's taking the modern, for him, the contemporary modern clothing, and using it as an analog for what the ancient old-timey clothing would have conveyed at the time. So actually he's giving you something deeper and more spiritual about the relationships between the people than if he had just tried to paint them in this perfectly historically accurate way. He's trying to get not at the matter, but at the form. And that's what translation, I think, should always be about. It should be about form and not matter. Matter is less important here. And you can go too far with that, of course. There are cases where the sound of a word really does matter. Like if the original has onomatopoeia in it, then you want to find some way of recreating that in the translation. But also, by and large, the basic gist of the thing is you're trying to get at the spirit through the vehicle of the flesh. And that's true, I think, about all human life, because ultimately I think that we are a kind of language. Our lives are a kind of language. We are in the image of God, who is the Word. But that now are really getting into heady stuff. Let me ground us now in some concrete examples so that I can show you how this might play out in a particular text, and then you will be able to go away and think about whether you get the impression that a given translation works or doesn't work. Obviously, the best way to do this is to learn the original language, and I do highly recommend and advocate going to ancientlanguage.com/youngheretics and checking out our sponsors there, and they can teach you how to speak Greek and read Homer in the original. But failing that, here are some ways that you can think about the first line, and I'm actually going to read the first 2 lines of Homer's Iliad, and the reason for that will become clear shortly. So here's Homer's Iliad, Book 1, Verse 1, in Greek. And I'll go on to verse 2 as well. Menina edethea peleiadio achilleos ulomenein he muriachaios alge etheke. Now, I am going to stop there. I'm not going to do anything more than that because I want us to get kind of granular and detailed here. And there are 2 things that I want to get us thinking about first as I embark with you upon this journey, and we will do many, many more things as we do other segments on this topic. But I want first of all to think with you about vocabulary, and then I want to think about meter or rhythm. And that is something that's distinct in poetry, but not unique to poetry, because prose texts also have a certain kind of rhythm. And hopefully you heard when I read that Homer's Iliad does have a regular pattern of meter, a regular rhythm. But first of all, let's talk about language. The first word of this poem is famously menis, is the nominative form of this Greek word, meaning, well, what does it mean? It means rage. And that's a great way of getting into talking about the fact that no word is really a synonym for any other word. And this will stress for you perhaps the difficulty of translation. There is no such thing in real life as a synonym. We talk about synonyms, words that mean the same thing. No word means the same thing as anything else. If they did, you wouldn't need both words. And this is true even within a given language, like my shrub bush example. And you can see in English how when you use different words, even if they kind of mean the same thing, they always carry different associations. And so this is certainly now true in translation from one language to another. There is no English word that means menis. Menis means menis. It means its own thing. And all the different words that we're going to talk about potentially using to translate this word, anger, wrath, rage, right? There are all sorts of words in English that mean basically what menis gets across, but not exactly, because these English words have their own history, they come with their own etymology and their own basis in our distinct context and the experiences that speakers of English have had throughout the centuries. And that's different from the experiences that thinkers of Greek have had, even though they ultimately have their core in a common human experience, because anger is one of the things that we all have, right? Everybody knows in anywhere you go, you're going to find some sort of concept of anger. So it's a really good first concept to use for thinking about the problems, the difficulty of translation, and also the possibility of translation. Hard, but possible, right? Everybody has the inward form experience, the spiritual experience called anger, but everybody has a different set of words for describing the shades of nuance and the various associations that they have with that feeling or that inward experience. So the question then becomes, how do I pick, right? I've got a range of different words that in English could get across the concept that menis gets across. How do I pick which one to use? And there are a bunch of different things that you might do, but let's talk about just a few of them. One is you could look for other places where the word menis in Greek appears. And this is very doable here because even in antiquity, this line was super famous, and so this became a major word in poetry, menis, rage or wrath or anger. And so in Greek, you have this wonderful tool called the TLG, the Thesaurus Linguae Graecae, where you can just look up like every instance ever of a certain word. I sort of did that in advance here, but you might, if you don't have that tool, you could still just think through, well, what are some other contexts where I've heard this word in the original? And when I searched for menis, I found perhaps predictably, a lot of examples in Homer, and then various others in poets throughout the years, in Pindar, for example, and I think there were some in Theognis. And I noticed a few things. So one thing I noticed is that Manus is often, though not always, a property of gods. Gods have Manus. Apollo has Manus. So this is something that can be consistent with the elevation of the divine nature. Then I noticed that this is a military thing too. You find it also with armies. The stratos, the army, will sometimes have or be driven by Manus. And so this off the bat will tell me a few things about context and associations, about the way that this word tends to land on the ear of a native ancient Greek speaker. Unfortunately, we don't have any around to quiz, but I can guess by looking at where this word appears and how this word is used, I can guess that this is not a word that is often going to appropriately be translated by the phrase pissed off, for example. This is not like a little sort of, oh, I'm so steamed, I'm so angry, right? Like that's not what Manus is. Manus is godly anger. And so I'm going to naturally err on the side of words like wrath or rage, because those are words that in my poetic tradition and in my English-speaking world often carry those what they're called connotations, right? The denotative meaning of a word, or the denotation is the thing that it means, the object or the experience that it stands in for. And then the connotation is the sort of cloud of associations around it, or the sense that it comes trailing with all these other feelings and ideas. So, okay, good. Now I have a little foothold, and I could do that for every word in this sentence and in this line and so forth. And sometimes you have to. Sometimes translators do that, but especially for important words, you want to think through, right? What are the connotations? It might be different in different contexts. So the word Manus here might be translated as wrath, and then what if I found it 5 lines down and actually it seemed like rage was slightly more appropriate? That is possible because the container that is the word Manus doesn't overlap exactly with the container that is the word rage or the word wrath. And we call this the semantic range. So semantic means, the meaning of a word is associated with the meaning of the word. And the semantic range is the whole kind of cloud or range of ideas and meanings that this word can cover. And always when you have one word in one language and another word in another language, or even 2 words in the same language that mean something similar, the semantic ranges are going to be like a Venn diagram. They're not going to overlap perfectly, and so there might be instances where Manus is better translated as rage, and other instances where Manus is better translated as wrath. So there's your first set of thoughts that you are having is, do the words here in this text land on me? If you're trying to evaluate a translation, do they land on me in the way that they seem to be supposed to land? So if I know, and I know some things about the Iliad, let's say I'm a fresh reader coming to the Iliad for the first time in English, I want to know how to evaluate translations. If I know that this is a poem about war from a time of antiquity, and I open the translation and it says, Achilles was really pissed off about how bad it was, or there was a translation of Beowulf a while back that started with the word bro. If I get that and I open up the text, even if I don't speak Greek, you might think, well, that doesn't seem quite right. That doesn't seem right for this. And that might be a clue in your head that the connotations here are off, that the translator hasn't done a very good job of clothing these ideas in that appropriate Renaissance clothing that is analogous, the right analog for the ancient world. So there's your first set of tools maybe for thinking through how to evaluate a translation. To get at the next one, I want to read to you a few English translations of this line, or of these 2 lines, so that you can hear the next set of concerns that I want you to be thinking about. The first one I'll read to you is Alexander Pope, and this is a classic but very free translation from the 18th century, 1715 to 20 is, I believe, when Pope created this. Here's his opening lines. Achilles' wrath, to Greece the direful spring of woes unnumbered, heavenly goddess, sing. Now, that's very beautiful, and Pope's translation is very beautiful. It's also quite free, which means that it doesn't stick directly to the literal meanings of each word. The more kind of direct way of translating this, if you just want to get at the kind of denotative meanings of everything that's being said here, Meneneida Thea, goddess sing the rage, Pelea Dio Achilleos, of Achilles, son of Peleus, Ulamenein, destructive, that is, the wrath was destructive, he muriachaios alge etheke, which placed grief or pain upon many Achaeans. The wrath was destructive, and it placed grief or pain upon many Achaeans. So here's Pope again. Achilles' wrath to Greece the direful spring of woes unnumbered, heavenly goddess, sing. So why does he do that? Why does he go so far off the beaten trail? He's getting the same ideas across, right? He's not totally deviating from the inner meaning or the experience that's being conveyed here, but to Greece, the direful spring of woes unnumbered. Well, some of this vocabulary is elevated in that way, especially, in Pope's time, it would have sounded less archaic than it does now, but it would still be elevated and elegant, and maybe it would get across some of that archaizing feeling that Homer is this great poet of war. But there's another reason, too, and you can probably hear it, and that is this is a metrical translation. It takes Homer and it puts him into what are called heroic couplets, which are iambic pentameter lines that rhyme. Every two lines will rhyme, so spring and sing, right? And then you'll have a new pair of rhymes. Iambic pentameter in English is our epic meter. It's the meter we use for epic poetry, which is the kind of poetry that Homer's Iliad is, and it goes like this. Da 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 da. It's got 10 syllables. They alternate in stress, and you have unstressed and stressed. So da 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 da. Achilles' wrath to Greece the direful spring, and you can play with it and vary it, but that's the basic idea. That's in English. In Greek, the poem, the Iliad, is written in dactylic hexameter, and hexameter. And like pentameter, hex means 6, pent means 5. So hexameter has 6 groupings of syllables rather than the 5 groupings of 2 syllables in iambic pentameter. And they're arranged in Greek, unlike in English, they're arranged by length, that is the duration of the syllables. So in English, we tend to organize our meters with stress, that is how forcefully you say a syllable. And so you take the natural stress of the word and you try to fit it into a pattern. In Greek, you have instead this length of syllables that creates a kind of rhythm. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but you can hear that there are 6 groupings of dactyls, which are da da da, long, short, short, and spondies, which are long, long. Now, there are a million other rules to this that we could get into, but I'm not going to bog us down with that here, because the main point I want to convey is, why does Pope translate this in meter, and why does he pick heroic couplets instead of trying to recreate the Greek meter, which would have sounded something like, Achilles' wrath to Greece the direful spring. He doesn't do that at all. It would sound insane to try and do that, although it's been attempted. And the reason for that is meter works differently in English, but there is an analog. There's a kind of meter, which is the iambic pentameter, that sounds to English ears the way that dactylic hexameter sounds to native ancient Greek speaking ears. And that the minute an ancient Greek is going to hear that rhythm, da 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 da, a whole kind of landscape or atmosphere is going to be conjured up, and that sense that you have when you start an iambic pentameter poem, that you're suddenly in this kind of elevated world, this world of heroes and great drama and epic and so forth. We get that from iambic pentameter. Homer's listeners would have gotten it from dactylic hexameter. And so this, again, the analog of rhythm and meter, not just stress, but also timing and how those things are arranged, is going to be another big question that will help you to shape a translation. And different people have treated this differently. So now I'll read you a few other options from a more recent history of how to translate this. And some of them will not be metrical. So there are a number of recent translations that have not imposed any sort of meter and have just given line breaks roundabout where Homer gives line breaks, but not tried to put in a regular rhythm. So, for example, here's Richmond Lattimore from 1951. He says, "Sing, goddess, the anger of Peleus' son Achilles." Or actually, he says Achilleus, which is a closer rendition of the Greek word. So that's the translation that I first read when I was in school. This was kind of the gold standard translation, Richmond Lattimore. I still like it in a lot of ways. I think that anger is a weaker word than wrath, as Pope uses, or rage or something like that. And you'll also notice that he's put the word anger into a place in the sentence that sounds more natural in English, but doesn't get across the power of the original Greek. So in Greek, because words change their shape and their structure based on their role in the sentence, you can be more free with where they show up. In English, it matters whether you say the cat ate the mouse or the mouse ate the cat, right? You have to use word order to convey meaning. In Greek, you don't have to do that as much, so you can play around. And Homer, by starting with menin, right, with wrath, tells you what the poem's going to be about in this very intense way. You suddenly off with a bang, right? Here you are. And we don't get that in the Lattimore version, which is why the next version I'm going to read, the Fagles version from 1990, is for me still the unbeatable translation in English. And Fagles tends to get some of the rhythm, but in a looser sort of way. So he's not as strict metrically as Pope, but he's more attuned to the rhythm, the kind of hoofbeats and heartbeats, as I like to call it, of dactylic hexameter. And he does find a way of starting with rage. So here's Fagles. Rage. Goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles. So he introduces a repetition, right? There's no repetition of the word in the original Greek. It's just menin. But it's so important that repeating it actually doesn't sound all that weird, right? Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles. And the whole translation is like that. It is loose and free in some places, but it gets so much of the feeling of the original across that I think Fagles is really still the guy to go with. And then I'll read you two others just so you can get a sense. One is from 2015. Caroline Alexander says, Wrath, sing goddess of the ruinous wrath of Peleus' son Achilles. And again, not strictly metrical, but still, like Fagles, paying attention to word order and to some of the rhythms, and starting with the word and then repeating it the way that Fagles also does. Wrath, sing goddess of the ruinous wrath. So that's, another way to deal with it, that she's basically following Fagles there, at least. And then most recently, Emily Wilson from the translation that was just published. And Wilson goes back kind of to the Pope approach, although she's much less elevated and dramatic than Pope is, and she puts it into iambic pentameter for all the reasons that I've just been saying, to do with the associations that carries, and you think of Milton, you think of Shakespeare and all these people. And so here's Emily Wilson, and she does not get the starting with Manus, which I personally think is a weakness. She says, Goddess, sing of the cataclysmic wrath of great Achilles, son of Peleus. But she does get this rhythm, right? Da 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 da. Goddess, sing of the cataclysmic wrath. And it's, again, there's variations in the pentameter and everything, but basically her translation proceeds the way Pope does with these regular iambic pentameter rhythms. So there's another tool that you can be looking out for, especially in poetry, but also in prose. What's the music of this text like? And does it seem to fit what I've been told about the work? So if you get a prose translation of a poem and it's all kind of flat and monosyllabic, and you know that it's supposed to be in this grand poetic meter, then maybe search for another translation. Look for one that is going to give you that rush of feeling and elevation, or is going to get across whatever those features of the original are. Hopefully, with those two, that's just to start with, a couple things to be thinking about. I can begin helping you to answer this question that you guys often write into me with about how do I make these choices? How do I choose this or that translation? Think about whether the words carry the feeling that is supposed to come with the text, and think about the meter and rhythm and the music of the text. I'm going to close it off there. This is really, really fun for me. I hope it's fun for you guys too. Once again, go to rejoiceevermore.substack.com and let me know if there are particular texts or ideas or lines from the Bible, let's say, or from some particular work that you've been reading that you have a big burning question about. I would love to do some of these words segments that are specifically about, well, how do I translate, for example, Bitula in Isaiah or whatever. This, how do I get at this particular idea? That would be really, really fun for me, hopefully helpful for you as well. And that's it for this Friday episode of Words at Young Heretics. I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.